name is Tess, and I hope you had a really good morning. It was an excellent keynote, yay. Um, we're here to talk about UX, or at least I am, and hopefully you'll come along with me on this journey. I'm Tess. I work as a developer and a technical evangelist at Microsoft. So software is built up in two parts. It's what we do, so all the features, and how we do it. So just like with people, software has features, and it has a way to communicate those features with other human beings. It used to be that you could sell software just by its features alone. You just list them on a box, people would buy the software, and life was great. But then Steve Jobs came along and ruined that for us. He created this app store, which is kind of like a Tinder for apps, where you go, nah, okay, I could install that app. So a good UI and a good UX is essential for user acquisition. But you might think that that's kind of where it stops. This doesn't really apply to me because I create in-house systems where sellers place orders, and they have to use my software. It doesn't matter if it looks good. They're kind of married to me already, so. But turns out that's very, very wrong, because that's where UX is even more important. Because every minute that your sellers spend in your systems, because your system is inefficient, and that amplifies, there's money lost by your company. And every time they can't place an order because they don't know how to, that is money lost by your company. And every time they place the wrong order, they lose their customers. And obviously, that's also money lost by your company. So bad UX costs a lot of money. But the problem is that UX, that's fine, that UX is a fuzzy subject. It's not something that we can deal with using unit tests or any kind of development approach that we're used to. But luckily for us, these two guys, Steve Herbst and Michael Medlock, they used to be UX researchers at Microsoft, specifically in the Xbox division. What they did was they took around 100 years of UI research, so design of everyday things, design of computers, design of basically anything, and they took all that research and they looked at what do people say makes a good user interface. So they categorized all that into something they call tenets, so attributes of good user interfaces. And then they looked at what are all the bloopers, all the do's, don'ts, all the things that you should try to avoid, and they call them traps. So they created a system called tenets and traps, where tenets are good attributes of, or attributes of good user interfaces, and traps are things that basically make the user interfaces not so good. And they created kind of structure in the madness, and I'm going to go through what these tenets and traps are. Not all the traps, because there are many of them, but at least a few, so you'll have a feel for what they are. And then at the very end, I'm going to quickly talk about how I use this when I do UX reviews. But even if you're never going to do a UX review, that's fine too. You just take away the attributes and take away the traps, and you can at least have a feel for what you should avoid in your systems. So to go through the tenets, I'm going to use the example of a scanner. So hopefully most of you know what this is. You pick it up when you get to the store, you scan all your items, you get to the checkout, put it in the rack, and pay. And you can do your whole purchase without even talking to a cashier, which is an awesome thing, I think. But it turns out this actually does have a very good user interface, so let's go through what it does. First off, the first attribute is understandable or understood. All of these tenets are actually an adjective, like understandable or understood, and it also comes with a quick sentence that says, for example, I know what I can do. So when you go through your user interface and you hear, oh, I know what I can do, or I know how to do this, then it's understood. And if you hear the reverse, I don't know what I can do, then it's not understood or understandable, so then you're failing in this attribute. So in this case, obviously when you pick it up, you pretty quickly realize how you're supposed to do things, because it has one big button that you use for scanning, and it's a pretty understandable system. It would be really bad if you had to have a cashier follow you along the first time, or if you had to have a manual to explain to you how to do this, because then you would never use this. So the first tenet, understandable. Second one is physically effortless. Physically effortless meaning that if you know what you should do, then you should be able to do it really quickly too. In this case, when you go around with a scanner, you're in a situation where you have a bag with groceries in the other hand. You might have a few kids in tow. Maybe you have a latte that you picked up before shopping. So you have to realize the constraints of where you are when you go through and build your user interface. And in this case, it should also be super quick to scan something. It shouldn't be hard to kind of get the barcode scan. Next one is responsive. So responsive meaning that you should get a quick response. In this case, when you scan something, you should get an immediate feedback. It doesn't necessarily always mean that you have to have, like, that the task has to be executed super fast, but you do have to get feedback fast. So you do have to know that you actually scanned something. And if you didn't get quick feedback, what would happen would be you would think that you hadn't scanned something, and you would end up scanning maybe 10 cartons of milk instead of 8. It also needs to be efficient. Efficient meaning that to do the most common tasks, to get from point A to point B, you should have as few steps as possible. Efficient doesn't always need to be the fewest steps, but the fewest perceived steps. To take an example with a scanner, if I need to buy 10 cartons of milk, the fewest real steps would probably be to scan something and then press times 10. But it turns out that that would make me switch hands, which means that it's not as efficient as if I would just scan 10 times instead. So all of these have variables, but efficiency is definitely one of them. Next one is forgiving. Forgiving meaning that I should be able to undo my actions as far as possible. Obviously, it's not possible to undo all your actions in all systems. But for example, in the case of the scanner, if I scan too many items, I should be able to minus scan them, which the scanner does nicely. It also needs to be discrete. Discrete meaning that it doesn't overshare information. So it doesn't post on Facebook every time I buy a carton of milk. It doesn't have a siren saying, hey, you did something wrong. Actually, in the case of a scanner, something that is a little bit of a pet peeve for me is that sometimes when I go shopping, I like to buy a bar of chocolate, just to keep me company during the shopping. I don't necessarily need my husband to know that. And every month when we get these loyalty card statements, I get this statement saying, hey, you get 20% off cream cheese because you buy a lot of cream cheese. Good. And you also get 20% off chocolate bars. That kind of stuff is things you need to think about when making it discrete or not discrete. Next one is protective. Protective meaning that when I enter data, for example, let's say I'm on the web, filling out a form. I enter a lot of data, go to the next page, and then I realize that, I should have changed something on the previous form. And I go back, and the form is blank. That happens all the time. And that is not being protective of your data. In the case of the scanner, one of my friends, she deals with most of the hackathons we do, and oftentimes she goes out and buys like tons and tons of energy drinks and pizzas and stuff like that. And this one particular time, she had filled up her cart, scanned all her items, and the scanner went blank. She was like, because suddenly she realized that she had to rescan all the items again. But she went to the cashier put her scanner in the rack, picked up a new one, and it was already filled up with all her items. So that is being protective of your data. Very nice. The next to last one is habituating. Habituating meaning that if you're in this app, or if you're using this machine or whatever, the first time it might be a bit hard to use it. I mean, you need to learn a few things, but the next time, and the next time, and the next time, it should be fairly quick to achieve mastery of the tool. So things you might think of that makes it more habituating is, for example, putting OK buttons in the same place, because then you get things like muscle memory, just making it easy to, once you know a few tasks, make it easy to perform the rest of the tasks because they're similar to the first ones. And finally, the last one is beautiful. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, and beautiful doesn't necessarily have to be like great animations and pretty pictures in the background and things like that. What it means is that it needs to have good craftsmanship. So things need to be nicely aligned. Buttons need to be the same size. Use the same colors, that kind of thing. Make sure that the user feels like you actually put a lot of effort into this, because otherwise I won't feel comfortable when I get to the checkout to put my credit card in there, if I see that the system is built by someone who really didn't care about what the system looks like. So these are the tenets. And then each of the tenets has a set of traps. And we're not going to go through all of them, but we're going to go through some of them. So one trap, for example, being data loss at the bottom there. If you have data loss, your system is not protective. Or if you have slow or no response, it's not responsive. Or if you deal with bad prediction, then it's not efficient. So we're going to go through first the understandable part. So there are mainly two big ones. Understandable and habituating are the two main attributes that everyone kind of comes together on. So we're going to spend most of our time there. Understandable is divided up into 4 different parts: perceptible, noticeable, comprehensible, and confirmatory. So noticeable meaning that, for example, if you're going to go into a system and you need to print something, is there a print button on the screen, or is there a menu like that you would, a physical item on the screen that allows you to print? And if it's there, do you notice it? Or are you distracted by other things so you're not focusing on the right area where you should click the print button? And if it's there and noticeable, do you actually understand the icon or understand how to use it? And finally, if you click the print button, do you get appropriate feedback so that you understand that it's done or what you should do next? This is Windows 8. It's the Outlook app for Windows 8. And the question here is, how do I search? So in Windows 8, I'm sure a lot of you know, one of the pillars of the design language was content, not Chrome, meaning that we should get rid of all the stuff that kind of distracts from the Chrome. One of those things was search, because search was repetitive and it was ugly. So it was put in a charms bar. Problem with this is it's not on the screen, so it's an invisible element. And a lot of people didn't know how to search, and thus couldn't do the simple task of searching, which was a critical task. So what they had to do was bring back search in the apps to resolve this trap of invisible elements. Sometimes it's okay to have invisible elements, like shortcuts, or even in this case, it could be okay to have an invisible element, as long as it's easy to discover this invisible element, which it turned out it wasn't. Sometimes you have to experiment to realize that something is bad too. I want you to hold up your thumb, and hold it up so you can kind of cover you only see this much as once. That is essentially how much you can see at any given time. You might think that you can actually see the whole screen, and this is just a bogus statement. But what it is you see this much, and the rest is filled in by your brain, because you're scanning things super fast. But our attention is really limited. This is really how much we see at one time. And most of the traps that we run into are because of limitations for us as humans, like our attention, or what we can see or hear or remember. I'm going to show a video, and a lot of people have probably seen this before, but even if you have seen this before, I would like you to follow the steps in the video. Should be some appropriate music to this, I think. Okay, so how many of you hadn't seen this video before? And how many of you didn't see the gorilla? Okay, so quite a few still. So this video kind of proves a couple of things. First off, a lot of people miss like the obvious gorilla, even though it's there, because your focus is on the white players. But it proves something that is even more important, and that's if you've seen this video before, you can't unsee the gorilla. So if you're one of the Windows 8 developers, you can't unsee the Charms bar. So when you review your UI, you will always see the Charms bar. Someone else has to review your UI for you, or someone else has to use it while you're watching for you to see the traps. And even if you saw the gorilla, you probably can't tell me how many outlets there were at the bottom, unless you're got superpowers in the attentive space. This is an early version of an Xbox UI. It's blurry on purpose because this is about how much you focus on. So when you go and search for a video, normally you would go and search around the video app. Turns out you should search down here, which is kind of out of the field of view. So even if it's something that's on screen, it's not something that's actually visible to the user that searches for it. So it's an effectively invisible element, which can be fixed by moving it to the appropriate space. And we see this over and over. I have tons of examples. I'm not going to show you too many of them now, but just keep an eye out for where the user focuses and try to put things around there. This is Word 2007. They experimented and put the print or the file menu up here. Not only does this not look like a file menu, or it looks like a button, it doesn't even look clickable in a sense. So it becomes an uncomprehended element and also an effectively invisible element. And this was later fixed by putting the file menu back. So even if it's there, you may not always notice it. This is iPhone, an early version. Where do I go to listen to music? Most people would think you would go to the iTunes Center because that's where the music notes are. Instead, you should go to the iPod section. So this is something that looks right, but it's wrong. We call this an inviting dead end, because what happens is you'll go into the iTunes section, and you won't find your place, and then you'll go out, and then you'll go into it again because it looks so right that you won't stop yourself from doing that. So they fixed this by changing the iPod to music. Do you know what this is? I think if you need to put a sticker on it, there's probably something wrong. So for guys, this is an inviting dead end. And for women, this is an uncomprehended element. So depending on your expectations. Now, we've talked a lot about this, the election yesterday. So in 2000, there was also an election. And there was a particular thing that happened. I'm not sure if you guys remember, but in Florida, Pat Buchanan suddenly had a very large amount of votes in Palm Beach County. It wasn't necessarily because he's been out campaigning a lot in Palm Beach County, but it was because of one of the biggest UX or UI problems in US election history, which was the Florida butterfly ballot. So the Florida butterfly ballot, if you were to vote for the Democratic Party, people would frequently vote number 2. Sometimes they would vote 2 and 3 because it was kind of confusing. So that's how they discovered the problem, but this turned into that. So I hope that didn't happen yesterday. But poor grouping can be bad. Mute to call. Here. Here. We've all seen bad grouping, even like, putting radio buttons far apart or checkboxes that don't apply to the titles and things like that. So, but this kind of shows that this kind of UI and UX problems don't always have to do with computer user interfaces, but it applies to everything in life. Finally, if you give feedback, make sure you give some actionable feedback. Physically effortless. Physically effortless, or the traps here, have to do with 2 things: targeting and readability. So targeting meaning that, for example, buttons that you press should be large enough to press, or any affordances really. And readability, you shouldn't have like a very busy background with light gray text, or if you're designing for TV, then you need to have fonts that are readable from the sofa and that kind of stuff. So a couple of examples of this. Pokemon Go, they changed this, luckily, but it's very, very hard to click the retry button in here. This is something called accidental activation. So when you want to do something, but you manage to press another button, you have accidental activation. And this one might not be so obvious. This is effective messaging system. You have like, comment, and flag for inappropriateness. And it looks like a perfectly sound system until you put it in the right context. And you realize that if you were to comment something, you would almost always flag it as inappropriate at the same time. So when you're designing for something, make sure that you're designing and testing it out in the right context. So with a scanner, in the store, in bad lighting, and so on, here on the appropriate screen. This is accidental activation and also a physical challenge, like trying to get to the buttons. How do you take a screenshot? Most phones, it's the same way. Power key on volume down, or power key and volume up, or something like that. This has 2 different traps. The first one is that it's an invisible element. So you don't know how to do it because it's not pointed out on the screen. In this case, having a special snapshot button, I don't know, it gets too busy if you're going to have that many buttons, but still. The other problem it has is that how do you do this without accidentally turning your phone off. About half the time I take snapshots, I turn my phone off. That's accidental activation. So it turns out taking phone snapshots is so hard, there's even a site for how to do this. Sorry. In terms of responsiveness, a golden rule for responsiveness is that if something should be quick, it should be done in like half a second. Like if something seems easy, it should be done in less than half a second. If something takes more than half a second, you should have some kind of indication that it's going to take longer, like a spinner or something. And if it takes more than around 2 seconds, then go ahead and put something like feedback that changes after time. So with a percentage, or telling, hey, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, so that people see that it's progressing and it's not hanging. They did a study, Google and Bing did a study at a Velocity conference in 2009, where they delayed responses to search results. And I put this in there because I think people say, okay, so I know that things should be responsive, but this is how much it costs. Sorry. If they delayed a response with 2 seconds, it made people click 4% less. 4% in the amount of money that Google makes, for example, is a lot of money just by that small response. And it turns out that that delayed response was something that people lived with long after the study. So the study was for 2 weeks, but even a month after, people were acting as if the responses were super slow. Efficiency. So one of the problems with efficiency, or that makes something not efficient, is information overload. So this was how you search for a Jeep dealer in 2002. Lots of texts. I mean, there are bullet points, but you can't really see that there are bullet points. And then there are like three pieces of information you have to fill out. They cleaned this up a little bit, made it a lot faster to read, removed one of the boxes. But you can see even like this, just formatting the text, it makes it a lot easier for a human to comprehend, and thus a lot faster for someone to process. But then they went all Google on us and made this. And this is really all that was needed for this. And filling this out takes a split second. Filling the first one out takes takes a lot longer, for sure. Information overload. This is the Xbox site on the web. It asks, hey, do you want to buy an Xbox? Halo? Oh, your recent activity shows that you've been playing Halo on Xbox. This thing is called system amnesia, and it occurs when the site should know something, but it isn't using what it knows, and thus presents us with unnecessary choices. So these kind of things makes the site look stupid, but it's also inefficient because it could fill these things up with a lot of better options instead. And obviously the main cause of inefficiency, bad autocorrect. I mean, how many times have you written a message and had to rewrite it like 4 to 5 times because it keeps autocorrecting the same way? We're going to go on to habituating. Habituating meaning that once you've learned something and done it a few times, it should be easy to, you should basically just be doing it automatically. So I want you to think back to the first time you drove a car. If you haven't driven a car, just pretend this is your first time. So the first time you drove a car, you probably had a lot of things on your mind. Like, I should adjust the rear view mirror, the seat should be adjusted, crank the key, maybe a little bit too much, made a weird noise, was that supposed to happen? And then there are all these other cars, and these signs, and these people on the street, and what am I supposed to do here? And then is this for moving forward, or is this for braking? And What happens if I don't brake in time? And like all these things running through your head that almost makes it impossible to perform the task of driving. If you go back to the last time you drove a car, the experience was probably a lot different. You could probably solve like a good piece of your workday in your car, right? Thinking about like how you should implement this crazy algorithm or whatever it is you do. Driving has become so automatic that you sometimes don't even realize that you've been driving and you drive in the wrong direction. But what would happen if you had two sets of pedals? Would that make it easier? Because if you have two sets of pedals, you have like double the amount of ways to do something. It should be more efficient because you didn't have to decide on one or the other. Or maybe that's the problem, because you do have to decide on one or the other, and which one is better. This thing is called gratuitous redundancy, when you have multiple ways to perform the same exact action. And although it seems like a good idea, it's often a very, very bad idea. What would happen if, for example, when you went north and south, the pedals would work one way, and then when you went left and right, or east and west, they would work the other way? Kind of like if they switched the OK and cancel button on you all the time. Yeah, you know? So variable outcome is also not a very good thing. This is Facebook. How do you send a private message to someone on Facebook? Well, you can do it like this, or here, or here. Actually, there are probably 14 more ways that you could send a private message to someone on Facebook. I don't even know why they do this. Maybe it is because they don't want you to send private messages to someone. Because this gratuitous redundancy means that if you're going to tell your mom how to send a private message to someone, you have to think about which way would she actually want to do it, or do you explain all the ways? It's something that makes it very hard to explain something to someone and also create a habit of how you should do it. So most people resort to the Messenger app instead. Where's room 3600? Well, here, wait, and here. But which way is best? You will never know. You do? Okay, that's good. This is Windows Phone 7. The search button would go to Bing. In some cases, except when it didn't. When it was a first-party app, like this mail app. But how does my mom know that this is a first-party app? She wouldn't. So she would press the button and it would be like sometimes it did and sometimes it didn't. So variable outcome is a very bad thing. Like if your pedals would suddenly switch places. They fixed this by adding search in the apps and making it always go to Bing. Or Cortana if you're in the US, but that's different. On iPhone, again, early versions, text messages, you would create a new one. But if you create a new one, like a new email, you would go down here. Didn't really have a consistency in the way the system was laid out. So people would put new everywhere. And if you wanted to go by muscle memory, you would sometimes do new and sometimes do edit, because you tend to always click on the same place on the screen. Like you tend to always click OK to messages when you get like long informational messages, for example. And then suddenly someone comes up with something really important there, and you're screwed, kind of. But inconsistent placement of really common things is a bad thing. Here, it's another version of this. You have the new button and the new button, but they look different. So you have to stop an extra second or two and kind of, is this new? because I'm used to new being the text new. Again, something that stops you in your flow and makes the user interface not drop into the background. I'm not going to go through beautiful too much, but I'm going to talk about a little bit about how I use this in, when I do UX reviews. So what I do is I have this sheet with all the tenets and all the traps. And then I go through whatever I'm supposed to be reviewing. So let's say I'm reviewing an ordering system. In that case, I take 3 to 5 common scenarios, something that people will be doing on a daily basis, and say, okay, so they're going to place an order for, being pretty specific, place an order for 5,000 items of this kind, and then go through and confirming that order. And then you go through all the ways that you can perform that scenario. So if there are multiple ways to perform that scenario, make sure you go through all of them. And have someone, either if you're creating an in-house system, then have someone, some of the people that are supposed to be using it, try it out. If you're creating an app for the public, then have a colleague try it out, or someone that's not you. And then watch them and try to identify any traps that they run into, or any time they say something like, I don't know what to do here, or man, it's really hard to hit this button, like things like that. And then you fill this out, and if you can't find the exact trap, you can normally at least find out which tenet is missing or which tenet is failing. And then you document all of these and discuss them. So sometimes there might be a trap, but you might decide not to do anything about it because the trap is kind of insignificant. As opposed to, like, if you would fix, let's say, for example, the Apple remote. On the Apple remote, there's no visual artifact for fast forwarding on a TV show. But they did this to make sure the Apple remote was really clean and minimalistic. And if they did, like, if they would have to put like fast forward buttons and fast backward buttons and all that stuff. So sometimes, if it's easy enough to discover it and not run into this trap, you might still not want to fix the trap because there are other things like the beautifulness that is more important. So you have to weigh and discuss these things together. So that's essentially how I use this. So hopefully these 40 minutes have given you a few tools to figure out how we can make the world a little bit better place to be with better UX. Thank you.